Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're excited to be with you to share a methodology and several free resources for applying GIS to advance racial equity, social justice, and sustainable inclusive development. To help us understand who's here, we have two quick poll questions we'd like to ask while everyone is settling in. Rosemary, could you please launch the first poll question so everyone can respond while I review the housekeeping details? Some basic things you're all probably familiar with by now, but we'd love you to complete these polls at the start of the session. We'll have time towards the end for some question answer discussion, so you can enter your questions into the chat at any time. Your microphones will be muted, and then at the very end of the session, we'll have a brief survey just asking for your feedback on this webinar. And if you would like to be contacted by someone from Esri to follow up and provide you with help for anything. So let's go ahead and launch the second poll, please. And we'll give people just a few minutes to complete that. Okay, Rosemary, could you please close the second poll? Fantastic. So my name is Angela Lee, and I lead Esri's outreach efforts and education licensing program, supporting colleges and universities in teaching GIS. I've worked closely with the AAG for many years and am excited to collaborate on this webinar. Both Esri and AAG recognize the urgent need for more diversity and inclusion in geography and GIS, and both organizations have taken steps to address the need. We also recognize that geography and GIS can be powerful tools for understanding our communities and addressing racial and other inequities to create positive change and provide greater opportunity for everyone. I'd like to welcome and introduce two leaders of Esri's Racial Equity and Social Justice team, Clinton Johnson and Koye Brown, who will lead our presentation. Clinton leads Esri's Racial Equity and Social Justice team. He also founded and leads the North Star of GIS, an organization focusing on racial justice, equity, and belonging for Black people and people of the African diaspora in GIS. He spent over 20 years helping organizations use technology to serve communities. He seeks to use GIS, tech strategy, intersectional racial justice, and empathy for a more equitable world. He also advocates tirelessly for belonging in STEM for Black people and other marginalized groups. Joining Clinton is Koye Brown, an urban geographer who uses modern mapping tools to support mission-driven projects around the world. At Esri, Koye is a solution engineer on the global infrastructure team, meaning she works with customers to design strategies for solving their particular challenges using GIS. She is also the engineering lead for the Racial Equity and Social Justified Unified team at Esri. Koye will demonstrate some of the ArcGIS solutions this team has created, including the Racial Equity Community Outreach solution and the Business Inclusion solution. Before Clinton and Koye begin, let's take a quick look at the poll results. We're also joined today by my colleague, Rosemary Boone, who's orchestrating this session for us. So thank you, Rosemary, for launching the results. So we have a nice mix, students, educators, and some people who maybe are outside of academia. That's fantastic. And then the second results, Rosemary, can we see? Okay, so we have, again, a nice mix. Some people already using GIS to investigate these issues. Some people that would like to. So fantastic. That's really helpful to know more about our audience. Now that we have that, Clinton, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Angie. Hi, everyone. My name is Clinton Johnson. I use he, him pronouns, and I lead Esri's Racial Equity Unified team, as Angie described, where we focus on delivering geospatial capabilities and providing guidance to help organizations advance racial equity and social justice. I'm also the founder of a 501c3 nonprofit called the North Star of GIS. And since 2017, we've delivered engaging and educational events for over 2,000 guests, showcasing dozens of Black students and professionals sharing innovative solutions for business and social impact. Why are we doing this, and why does the North Star of GIS and organizations like that exist? Well, in our case, we find that there are either few Black people involved in GIS, aware of GIS. There's definitely a bit of that. But among those who are deeply involved in GIS, very often they are underrepresented in big events like events celebrating GIS Day and others. So, before organizations like the North Star of GIS, there were times when me and other Black people working in GIS might go for weeks without seeing another Black person, even when we were working on things that were focused on racial equity and social justice. And, you know, getting to what we're here to talk about, racial disparities like those and so many more place a higher burden on some individuals and communities than others, ultimately reducing the collective capacity of every city, every county, every region, and every country. So of course, racial equity is very important. But so why does this matter, and why does it matter in the work of GIS? Well, as Angie said, GIS and geography are tools used by policymakers and leaders in every sector that can be leveraged to have great impact. They already impact things like health services, public education services, commercial services, and people from marginalized groups really need to be involved in that work, whether represented in the folks whose understanding we need to really fully understand problems, but and also in terms of who's sitting at the table making decisions, um, curating and analyzing data. And and not only do we need to have people from marginalized groups involved in this work, we also need to have anti-racism and intersectionality to be at the front and center of work involving GIS and geography. So the North Star of GIS helps leaders, educators, and really everyday people advance intersectional anti-racism and increase belonging for Black people and other marginalized groups. And we leverage our lived experience, our GIS and STEM experience, combined with our expertise in racial equity and social justice to try to create pathways to sustainable diversity and belonging. And we encourage folks to leverage GIS, especially Esri's really complex ArcGIS system to tackle these issues. But let's talk a little bit um, more about like what this terminology is. I think it's always really important to be on the same page about terminology. So I want to use these flowers and the situation that they find themselves in to talk about inequity. And I'm sure you've all seen diagrams like this before. And the ones that I'm sharing were created by a group called ECOS. And ECOS works to drive environmental stewardship and inspire communities to foster sustainable futures. So what they've depicted here as flowers, we can think of as individuals, families, or communities situated somewhere in society. And we can think about each of these flowers as representing an individual, a family, or a community with a different set of social characteristics. So, having a different social identity. Maybe it's a racial identity, or a social identity that includes an intersection of some racialized identity. And you can think of the ground that the pots stand on as the foundation that those that came before them were able to provide. You can think of the fence posts between the flowers and the sun as the barriers that we all face of varying kinds and at varying levels. And you can think of the sun as opportunity or resources that contribute to health, education, economic, or social outcomes. And each flower is just not getting the same amount of access to the sun, to that opportunity. And over time, their health and their condition will suffer in varying ways as a consequence of that disparity. So someone's decided to be fair and provide the same resources to to each one of these flowers, and yet ultimately this approach wasn't fair. In fact, it increased disparities in some cases because some flowers are getting more sun than others, and one flower or community still isn't getting access to the sun or those resources at all. And some policies might seek to be fair and try to provide the same resources to every person, to every family and neighborhood, but a nuanced approach is needed to account for the different barriers that people face. To be more fair, many organizations are trying to provide resources that align with needs. They want to create policies that allocate resources to communities based upon the different barriers they face. People talk about this as investing where the needs are greatest. And true fairness in this context would be justice, the removal of all barriers. And many organizations are trying to identify policies that present barriers to some people and make adjustments in those policies to ensure more justice for all people. So for instance, this April, the CDC announced something about racism and health that many of you that many may have known for centuries. Um, and many more have been learning through the COVID-19 pandemic that racism is a public health crisis. The director made a statement declaring that as a serious public health threat, racism directly affects the well-being of millions of Americans, and as a result, it affects the health of our entire nation. The director went on to say that racism isn't just discrimination against one group based on the color of their skin or their race or ethnicity. It's the structural barriers that impact racial and ethnic groups differently to influence where a person lives, where they work, where their children play, where they worship and gather in community. And racial equity is increasingly a priority for many countries, including the US. And in many ways, governments are recognizing that racial equity and social justice have a key role to play across the board. It's clear that policies and decisions related to our management of the pandemic must be equitable to address racial disparities in COVID-19 and to address health equity more broadly. Economic recovery must address long persisting racial inequities that have created and sustained poverty in many communities of color. And climate change policies must address climate and environmental justice, recognizing that historic and contemporary policies have led to racial inequities that have resulted in areas where higher concentrations of environmental pollutants exist, also being areas that have higher proportions of Black and Brown people. And many organizations are stepping up to do their part to address racial equity, recognizing that racial injustice is everyone's problem to address. And many also recognize the need to do that work in collaboration across sectors. And one of the sectors that a lot of folks go to when trying to understand these issues is the educational space. And all of these commitments reflect decisions being made by organizations to intentionally increase racial equity, many of which require or are explicitly about policy changes. And organizations and communities will need to understand how their decisions will ultimately impact equity. And that's very often where geographers and GIS professionals come into play. I tell many people that for all of the work that activists may do around racial and other social inequities, at some point, policymakers approach geographers and GIS professionals to say, hey, where do I need to invest differently? Where are my policies having an impact on whom? Help me understand the intersection of my policies over space and over time. So it's very important that GIS professionals understand racial equity and social injustices. And when we think about, what is racial equity, I find that there are generally three answers to this question. Racial equity is a condition that's met when policies, practices, attitudes, and cultural messages no longer produce racial inequities. It's also a process. It's that work that gets done to address racial inequities. And both that condition and the process require analysis, some assessment or root cause analysis of racial inequities or other intersecting social inequities. And the overall goal is to achieve the condition of racial equity by doing the process of racial equity, all of which is informed and validated by racial equity analysis. And over time, Esri has evolved a set of guidance and tools to help organizations apply GIS as a framework for racial equity. And these organizations need GIS professionals and geographers who are well informed, not just about historical issues that affected people a long time ago, but about how those historical actions sustain today and create new disparities for folks still along the lines of race and other social characteristics, but also to understand how contemporary policies, decisions, and practices influence or impact all communities. And it's clear that any map that we make that is about people and about policies impacting people, if we don't include social characteristics like race, ethnicity, ability, gender, sexual orientation, and so on, we will very likely mask over, um, hide, conceal, and otherwise sustain or extend social inequities. So we provide a comprehensive set of guidance and tools that try to help folks to tackle this work. And the first two pieces of this are really about guidance to help people use GIS and geography tools that they likely already have, and really to figure out how to address some of the most compelling questions of our time, how to apply a robust intersectional racial equity lens to understand how decisions impact what people experience in various spaces, and ultimately how that impacts their outcomes, and how to move through their work while centering community, but bringing data and spatial analysis to bear to really understand needs, better allocate resources, and ensure that their practices are having the outcomes they seek. And then the other two pieces are about solutions, some of which Koye will share with you later. Solutions that are really either configurations of again, products that you may already have available to you, or focused ArcGIS solutions that are tailored around very specific equity-related workflows. And then we're here as a resource. The full Esri team across the board is being organized and rallied to help folks address issues of racial equity and social justice. So folks can reach out to their account teams and folks like Angie who can connect them with resources across the board to help with issues. And if organizations need some additional resources to get some of this work done, we can pitch in and help. But let me talk a bit about what it means to think about even what an equity lens is. So when we're talking about this first part here, it's important to recognize that while racial equity work often includes and needs to begin with race, particularly when we're thinking about in the United States, it also includes other characteristics that tend to be racialized. And so the reality is racial equity work is rarely about race alone. So racialized identities consist of many of these factors. Um, you know, Folks will have racialized experience, sure, because of their race or ethnicity, but also because of their tribe, indigeneity, caste, sometimes because of the religion that they follow, the language that they speak, or an accent they may have, what country of origin they come from, their immigration status, how many generations they've been in a new country, their family's been in a new country, their nationality. So, and all of those characteristics intersect with others like gender, sexual orientation, age, and things that we think of as socioeconomic class, and all of that stuff interacts with location to influence how we experience place and what services we experience in place. So organizations are trying to identify and understand disparities in things like asthma rates, may need to explore population groups at many different intersections, and perhaps find out that it's Black boys between 6 and 10 in median income communities in some part of a city, and Latinas in their early 20s living in higher income communities in some parts of the city, and white men in their early 30s in low income communities that are all experiencing the greatest disparities from the norm or the average. And also, when we just backing up a little bit, this lens is one that we apply to community to understand their needs. But these are lenses that organizations are also applying inward, trying to ensure that their workforce, their staff, their boards, the folks who they get input and influence from, the communities they serve, their customer base, they want to make sure that they actually reflect the communities that they intend to serve, or the communities that they find themselves situated in. And there are many resources that organizations use to try to tackle these issues, one of which are employee resource groups, or what other folks may call affinity groups or business resource groups. And at Esri, we have employee resource groups or ERGs, and ERGs get created for many reasons, chief among them being to provide a haven for belonging or beacon to promote belonging. They exist to create opportunities to increase diversity and talent acquisition. They exist to help increase development and retention of talent. And they also exist to expand business opportunities, right? Recognizing that this diversity of thought that everyone is seeking really comes from diversity of experience, that comes from diversity of social characteristics and social backgrounds that people come from. Recognizing that while one might think that women have a shared experience, that you can easily talk about, or that men have a shared experience that you can easily talk about, well, that leaves out folks who don't identify as men or women. And really, when we look at women, and very often organizations will say, oh, we've achieved gender parity because half of our staff are women, um, without necessarily bringing in other lenses like ability. How many of the women in your organization are dealing with a wide, some range of disabilities, and what is the racial makeup of the women in your organization, right? So recognizing that the intersections are really important, and through all of these intersectional identities, you get the kind of diversity of experience that, when combined with diversity of expertise, gives you the innovation that folks are seeking. So at Esri, I'll just talk a little bit about our employee resource groups. We're all committed to fostering diverse and inclusive spaces where our differences matter and are recognized to make us better. A culture that empowers people of all backgrounds to thrive, and our collective perspectives and knowledge are recognized and leveraged to make positive impacts. And we seek to ensure that our diverse communities are here and enabled to help solve some of the world's toughest challenges. And employee resource groups at Esri, like in many places, typically work in across two broad categories, and one being belonging and workplace equity and advocacy. So that includes, when thinking of workplace advocacy, it's really interesting because it's not just within your organization, but folks are looking across their industry. So many of the employee resource groups at Esri and in other places are really about making connections across their industry. Social change and community impact groups, right? You've got lots of organizations, lots of ERGs or business resource groups that are focused on helping their companies, their schools create more social impact. And one of the employee resource groups at Esri, North Star, which is the one I founded and lead, we worked in collaboration with others to actually start to create some of the standards around which we now have a racial equity and social justice team at Esri. So the ERGs are really important. There are lots of examples where ERGs have led to business innovation or social innovation at organizations. So this is something that you all should think about supporting and growing across the GIS community. And in your schools, I'm sure that there are also a lot of diversity and inclusion kinds of teams that work with career services within your org to make sure that people from diverse backgrounds, including first generation students, are finding pathways to success. And we want folks to find pathways into GIS and geography, that and also find and recognize the importance of applying equity lens as they are doing their work. And so when we think about applying these equity lens, like understanding all of these intersecting social characteristics to try to get a sense for where people may be experiencing inequities, what are we applying that to? Well, we're applying it to what is thought of as either root cause analysis methodology or racial equity and social justice outcome streams. And within these streams, there are three big components: decisions and practices, community assets and conditions, and outcomes. And so I just want to talk a little bit about what these mean. So in this model, outcomes are the indicators of how people fare. That's how individuals, families, and communities fare economically, socially, and so on. And they include educational attainment, school attrition, and so on. And then there's community assets and conditions, and these are the circumstances that surround people where they live, work, and play. And these community conditions and circumstances include things like access to quality health care, to education, to parks and recreation, and many other factors. And and what people are ultimately trying to understand are the decisions and practices, the policies, programs, systems, and budget decisions that influence circumstances that surround folks where we live, work, play, travel, and so on. And we're helping organizations find those historic and contemporary practices and decisions that create or sustain things like structural racism or other forms of discrimination, bias against or for people based on class, inequitable distributions of resources of power, and intergenerational inequities. And so we help folks to use this methodology with real data and spatial analysis. And I'll show you just a quick example or two of what this looks like. So the North Carolina Clean Air Carolina organization did a study of a priority area around Charlotte where citizens were experiencing higher rates of negative health outcomes, including smoking and obesity and chronic conditions. And there also appeared to be disparities in several community conditions like exposure to toxins. For instance, the historic West End, a predominantly Black community, has a disproportionately higher concentration of factories, waste sites, and truck stops, and other large harmful emitters of pollution. And when they looked upstream to decisions and practices, they found that Charlotte has this history of segregation that was bolstered by a history of redlining, and people in the West End live with that long-standing legacy of industrial zoning and highway construction that time and time again dumped large sources of pollution in their communities. And if we look at St. Louis, we see families facing histories of discrimination based on race, immigration status, and other social identities due to policies, again, like redlining and racial covenants. And redlining and segregation has been linked to temperatures in neighborhoods. And this map looks at how temperatures in neighborhoods align with redlining policies. So when we look at this grade A area, looking closely, we could see that this area has lower temperatures, and that those lower temperatures were linked to higher tree coverage and vegetation. On the other hand, this area that was graded D was one of the warmest areas, and that was linked to lower tree coverage and less vegetation, as well as higher proportions of paved surfaces. And these disparities in temperatures lead to higher energy bills, negative impact on chronic health conditions, and higher preterm births. And the CDC says these heat islands are impacting spaces like St. Louis, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and so many more. And they're expected to continue in intensity for decades to come. And there are so many examples of of organizations doing this work implicitly or explicitly. I'll highlight a few. So we talked about the lines that shape our city that made connections between redlining, tree coverage, housing values, and more. Segregation is Killing Us by Territorial Empathy made connections between, again, redlining, exclusionary school practices, and disparities in funding practices to things that were happening in communities around school policing, air quality and pollution, and ultimately to COVID-19 cases. Madres and COVID-19 from the Madres Center made connections between urban design practices and environmental contaminants and pollutions and COVID-19 resources and ultimately COVID-19 outcomes. And so folks are using the streams methodology to really try to identify issues and then find ways to create more equitable outcomes. And they're using, of course, lots of data and and spatial analysis tools to get that done. Really quickly, I want to talk a little bit about some of the methodologies that people are implementing that we've sort of discerned as what we call a racial equity and social justice workflow that has engaging communities at its center. And this is really one of the most critical aspects of this whole idea of using GIS as a framework for equity. And it's derived from emerging and best practices for advancing racial equity and social justice that we've observed, and we just infused all of what we saw with GIS and geospatial capabilities. Engage communities is at the core to support folks' efforts to engage citizens, residents, community leaders and organizations, and other stakeholders at every stage of the process. And this work typically begins with mapping and analyzing equity. Organizations really trying to advance equity are they need to proactively seek out inequities. They want to identify community assets that increase equity and opportunity. They need to be able to identify clear goals and objectives and measurable outcomes, all while engaging the community in the process. So this first step in the workflow is called map and analyze equity, meaning apply these intersectional, robust racial equity and social justice lenses to reveal and understand inequities, locate populations of concern, and identify barriers to equality. And these, at every stage, these pieces of the process really are multifaceted. There's a lot going on, and we just encourage folks that they can use Esri's Living Atlas to find data resources to enrich their own. They can use the community analysts and business analysts to produce infographics that'll help them explore communities. They can find training resources on the Racial Equity Hub to help them get started taking on some of the more foundational things or more challenging scenarios. They can work with some of the tools that they already have, like Urban and Pro, and they can use the new social equity analysis ArcGIS solution being released today, I think, to locate and visualize populations of concern and barriers that they face, and to help automate equity assessments. And I'm just going to skip ahead to the next part of the process is really about operationalizing racial equity and social justice. So with an understanding of where inequities are impacting populations of concern, organizations then seek to infuse their day-to-day practices, their big decisions and their small decisions with racial equity and social justice practices, meaning they want to ensure that their programs and services are distributed equitably, as well as making sure that the interventions that they're delivering and the policy work that they're doing will create real change. So the operationalized best practices stage is where organizations seek to design and plan equitable allocations of resources, alleviating burdens on communities of color, and using technology to automate some of that work. So at this stage, we encourage folks to really use ArcGIS in every form and flavor that it comes in to help identify more equitable resource allocations, automate their work, including the work of their teams on the ground, inform decisions using the right configurations of products, data, training, and services, embed equity directly into their existing workflows. And again, they can use this new solution to help to identify better opportunities to serve communities. And then finally, organizations need to ensure that their efforts to increase equity are having the impacts they seek. So in the managed performance stage, organizations use decision-making tools to visualize racial inequities at a glance to adapt strategies and operations accordingly. And, folks can use maps to understand racial inequities and other social inequities within their communities. They can really operationalize their racial justice efforts by infusing equity directly into their workflows, embedding them in the workflows through automation and leveraging tools to configure business processes that are equity informed. They can use the new ArcGIS solution and other tools to really assess the impact of their efforts on community, and they can engage the community all along the way using story maps that put their solutions and the work that they're doing within the context of the inequities that they were working to address. And using surveys, they can connect with community members, community leaders, and community organizers to align their understanding of the needs with their operational performance and their plans, and also get a clear sense of sentiments and realities along the way. And the other piece of this are those racial equity and social justice solutions. So there are several there are now 4 ArcGIS solutions for racial equity and social justice. There's one solution is a community outreach solution. You'll see a bit of this from Koye in a few moments. And that solution provides a foundation that helps people get started by creating a single destination that they can start to rally forces around and engage community around to have a shared understanding of needs, have a shared understanding of the plans to address those needs, and have a shared understanding of outcomes all along the way. That solution also helps folks do that inward looking piece and assess the equity and representation of their staff by comparing their staff at various intersections like race, uh, gender, and age and years of service with the community at large to make sure that they are lining up and looking for opportunities to close gaps. There's a police transparency solution to help public safety organizations and communities connect more around the data that reflects the work and the actions of public safety agencies. And there's the business inclusion solution that I think Koye is going to get into a bit that helps folks tackle business inclusion within an organization, perhaps at your institution or in your organization. You provide services to businesses or you partner with businesses, and you want to make sure and you recognize that there are systemic and structural inequities that will make it harder for some businesses to find you to be successful in working with you, and for some businesses to be well engaged and succeed, whether in partnership with you and service to you. And so maybe you have some business inclusion programs. Well, you can use the business inclusion solution to help organize and assess the needs of various communities that you're trying to serve. And I'm going to stop here and transition to Koye, who's going to show you some of the magic that I'm describing in words. She'll show you indeed in action.
Thanks, Clinton. Hi, I'm Koye. As Angela stated earlier, I'm a solution engineer on the global infrastructure team, as well as the engineering lead for the Racial Equity and Social Justice Unified team here at Esri. Today, I'm going to continue the conversation around increased representation, but from a slightly different perspective, and talk about the tools we can use in this space to address this topic, in this space being the GIS space, to address this topic. In a broader context, when we think about racial equity and social justice as a business model, there are many ways organizations can lean in. One way is through talent management driven initiatives, but traditional KPIs and diversity metrics simply won't cut it because we consumers are looking for impact, a long-term transformative commitment that intersects business and community. So the role of the organization is a community stakeholder. Therefore, it must see themselves in pursuit of social justice and belonging. To achieve this, the organization must have a robust community engagement strategy. The community has a very powerful seat at the table. Communities have information relevant to the issues of quality of life. Therefore, they can help identify and remove barriers to opportunities, provide information about accessing resources, and establishing external accountability. So, when we think about racial equity and social justice as a lens of business operations, we're looking at policies, practices, and programs really to identify areas to be more inclusive and create opportunities. Now, what you're looking at is the Racial Equity Community Outreach Solution, which is basically a templatized set of sites, surveys, and apps. It has 3 parts. The first part is what you're looking at. You're seeing an engagement hub. It's a one-stop destination site for messaging and community outreach. The second part is the community survey. So it's designed for collecting rich information about race, ethnicity, gender, location, and sentiment. And the third part, a dashboard. It allows you to view your current workforce in relations to the communities being served. For this conversation, I want to talk about ways organizations can lean in to racial equity and social justice as a lens to business operations, and where GIS can support these initiatives. So, organizations can be anchor institutions, governments, NGOs, academia, or even global brands like Esri. Really, any organization can lean in to establish themselves as key players in this space. Now, positive practices for organizations is showing up with clear justice, diversity, equity, and belonging practices and policies that are implemented with consistency, where they're tracking adoption, communicating both internally and externally in compelling, authentic, culturally sensitive, and engaging ways. Then they report on the impact while monitoring sentiment of those folks that they're serving. So, with this recipe, organizations can position themselves to be key players in this space, shaping the corporate social justice landscape and driving revenue. In the equity space, we've seen brands take on initiatives in four larger categories, each with pluses and minuses. We'll be taking a look at solutions around three of these types of initiatives, like community driven initiatives. That's when a company publishes a statement to express solidarity. There's social oriented initiatives. So that's donating money to organizations or initiatives to fight racism, or even focusing on key issues like education. And then there's talent management driven initiatives. Here's where organizations can take a series of talent related measures like hire Black and Latino professionals, or make a switch from corporate social responsibility to corporate social justice. The racial equity and community outreach solution is able to blend the community driven and talent management driven initiatives. So, with this solution, there are several common sections like this introductory section here, which serves as a way to share supporting messages from your leadership. And here's where you start to look at the intersection of two things. One, the organization's mission statement, and two, the unmet needs of its stakeholders to ultimately arrive at a vision that the organization is best equipped in playing a part in creating. So once we get our focus, we can start to use metrics to measure performance and continually get feedback to gauge sentiment and improve processes. We can start setting programming around these focus areas to create opportunities. In this section, it allows folks to stay informed and attend upcoming events. So this is really a way to start to engage with your community stakeholders. And this last part is really important. So this section is where we get informed about our allies to the organization that share the same vision and values, as well as provide relevant data needed to explore current conditions or expand opportunities. Now, let's move on to internal and external accountability around the workforce. This dashboard is focused on workforce diversity. Because organizations are community stakeholders and communities are key players in addressing relevant issues, representation is important in any industry. Inequities can be maintained through business operations. So some examples would be supply chains, hiring strategies, customer bases, so who a company serves or doesn't serve. We can use this dashboard to understand the workforce as it reflects the community. So if we take a look at these first three percentages, we see that hiring of Hispanic folks is very low when compared to their community makeup. To make this actionable, organizations could take this to address internal pipelines through succession, look to increase representation in executive leadership roles, or prioritize funding towards diversifying the workforce through minority serving institutions, or simply have strategic initiatives to hire from underrepresented communities. Next, we have the details page. It provides these key breakdowns with race and combination, and they intersect with gender, years of service, and income. So we can leverage tools like this to address pay equity or wage equity for organizations to conduct a wage analysis. Let's take a look at facilities across a national footprint. For organizations with multiple locations serving in different communities, this dashboard allows them to see at a glance how they're doing. We can take a look at individual locations to see their equity score. In this case, it's medium. We can take it a step further to look at the community makeup. So when we overlay our locations with demographic data, we can use data to drive decision making or uncover inequities. Now let's shift to a society-oriented solution. This dashboard is all about following the dollars. For a company that leans in with society-oriented initiatives, following donation monies can be a big deal for reporting and establishing ways to measure impact. This is a perfect data visualization to see where your investment dollars are going and to help understand the communities being served. Let's zoom into the Chicago area. This area has 4 initiatives, all predominantly in non-Hispanic white communities. Here's where organizations can use this tool to manage performance around where they spend their money. Let's move on to look at ways we can support local businesses owned by underrepresented groups. The business inclusion solution is designed to engage women, veteran, and BIPOC-owned businesses. It can also be used as a community action hub, like we're seeing here. This is a great example of corporate social justice, where they're arriving at clear ways companies can engage. Communicating in authentic, compelling, and culturally sensitive, engaging ways. So this is really important when we're talking about applying a racial equity and social justice lens. So we want to remember the role of the community and the organization. So in the community, the organization is a stakeholder. So it's engaging with marginalized frontline communities and arriving equipped and playing a part in creating these better outcomes. An example is this wealth creation. So they're supporting the financial health of Black-owned businesses through growth and capital. Now let's wrap up. We can use GIS as a framework or as a tool to drive decisions around hiring pipelines, showing opportunities to do recruiting, and where they're putting their dollars in the communities that align with vision and values. I wanted to empower you to make an impact, bringing the right tools to lean into conversations around positive practices, increased representation, racial equity, social justice, or workforce diversity. With that, I'll thank you for your time today. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to Clinton.
Thanks, Koye. So hopefully you get the sense that there really are a comprehensive set of resources that we've been working on and have been bringing to bear. And some of what, very often I feel like we feel goes without saying, that was very evident in a lot of what Koye was sharing, is that need to people talk about disaggregating by race, and I just always wonder, like, what that means. How do you take aggregate data and break it down? But instead, we encourage folks to aggregate to the intersections of social characteristics that are important, some of which, of course, include race, ethnicity. So you see where Koye had, in many different areas, experiences and outcomes and resources broken down by racial groups, right? And I know, like, one of the common practices that feels perhaps like a best practice to some is to purely look at the U.S. Census white as a category, and then the inverse of everyone who's not that, as being somehow not for on the one hand communities of color, some kind of fictitious group of communities of color that don't necessarily equitably exist in that way in reality, given how segregation tends to look in communities. But instead, we've broken that out. Some of the fallacies of using even US Census white as a category without understanding who's in that group, because that group, according to the US Census, includes Middle Eastern folks who get racialized along for being Middle Eastern and in other ways as well, and North Africans again who get racialized for being North African. So you wanna find the best ways to aggregate your data up to the intersections of social characteristics and and other characteristics that you really want to understand. And to help you all get started, it's funny, you can go to the Racial Equity website. We've got some resources for developers who can take advantage of all of these same a lot of these same capabilities and build them into solutions. You can go to learn.arcgis.com and start to find some learning resources. We have a growing collection of training material that is focused on racial equity and social justice related scenarios. And I just want to leave this resources slide up for folks and turn things back over to the organizers here to help us take some questions if there are any.
Yeah, fantastic. That was great. I really found the idea of streams as you're looking at some of these issues really helpful to see kind of the interdependencies. As a geographer, holistic thinking, that made a lot of sense. And so we've received some great questions. So the first one, much of the work I've done in using GIS for racial justice simply looks at the concentrations and patterns of access to resources across communities of color. Are there any particular spatial analyses that are especially helpful? For example, geographically weighted regression, or are there any other advanced applications you could recommend?
Like I said, we're releasing a solution today that'll help folks take some first steps to understand how multiple conditions come together to create benefit or burden. But folks have to sort of have some and that'll help people actually tinker around and get some sense of where and how to weight things. That solution also helps people combine different social characteristics to try to find populations. But I think one of the things I'll say is really important is sometimes just the simple direct approaches work, because in some ways some of the questions that folks are asking are just are Black women experiencing pregnancy and birth outcomes differently from other people, right? So you kind of want to very often a response to that question shows up in data as let's compare the white population to the non-white population and see what we see. Well, the question was, are Black pregnant Black women experiencing different outcomes, during birth outcomes? So actually finding the right intersections of data to identify very specific populations is important. So understanding that racism, even if we're looking at just racism, isn't this monolithic experience that every non-white group is experiencing. It's impacting. There are communities that we think of as white who are racialized as immigrants or as North African or Middle Eastern. And we want to understand how they're experiencing certain outcomes differently from others. And of course, we've got all of the non-white racial categories as they show up in census that do or do not exactly relate to how people think of race and ethnicity. So I think before even getting to really advanced analysis, breaking down communities so that you can understand communities around specific issues and topics, and being comfortable with the idea that for the hundreds of different issues that people are experiencing, that you may have hundreds of things that people think of as indices that you pull together as you think about how, as an organization supporting a recreation agency, how specific sets of recreation resources are or are not impacting specific communities differently around health-related concerns or education-related concerns. These kinds of discussions played out in data require different data sets. So I'd say before you even think about some of the really advanced stuff, sometimes you just want to understand, have I broken down the communities in the right way? Have I separated social characteristics that tend to lead to inequitable outcomes, like experiences like racism being reflected through racial characteristics, or sexism being reflected through gender or sex assigned at birth? Have I separated those out from what I'm trying to understand in terms of burdens or barriers, so that you can get a geographic distribution of need, and then start to explore how general population, everyone, experiences some specific topic differently from each other group or some group that's in focus.
Yep. Thank you. That's helpful. Another question. A project that I'm currently working on is focused on the cultural diversity of my study area. While it's not specifically equity focused, how can I integrate these equity tools to ensure my work is sensitive to the various communities in my study area? So maybe are there some resources from the Learn ArcGIS project you could recommend as a starting point, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, there definitely are some resources that we're looking to develop, and we're trying to in some way lace some of this stuff into everything we provide through Learn as it relates to racial equity and social justice. So engaging communities, as I described, is at the core of everything. So giving people the tools that they need to understand, um, to engage community, to make sure that what you think the issues are, or what you think the landscape is actually what the community sees the landscape to be. To understand that, to engage the community, to make sure that as you're building and executing your big plans, that they understand your big plans, that they have awareness, and then also engaging the community's sentiments around all of these things. Do they think your plan will, they agree with your assessment of need, they agree that your plan will be successful in what it's trying to accomplish, but do they think that your plan addresses the needs? Do they, how do they feel in general day to day around these issues? So having survey tools that you can use to assess all of that, sort of sentiment and experience from the community is important. And then making sure that as you do, whatever your cultural context is it around gender, is it around race, is it around ethnicity, is it around language, whatever it is, figuring out what those elements are, going a little bit further, right? Like understanding that there will be something at the intersections of what is for you the core, and when you're engaging the community and you're collecting that information, try to build trust, so that you can also capture those social characteristics. So when you're looking at what you learn from the community, you don't find yourself being swayed by the predominant results that maybe come from the people who are best positioned to get access to you and your survey tool and have time to fill it out, that you can see where those gaps exist. And if you're trying to understand communities, that you can see how folks' experiences and understanding of community differs along all of those intersectional lines. And we want to build some learn lessons to help people figure out how to do that. The North Star of GIS also is releasing a set of practices over the next year. It's funny, I think that the practices around engaging community and survey come midway through next year, but you can always reach out in advance and we can talk about how we can share some of those insights early.
Great. Fantastic. We're at the top of the hour, so I think we need to wrap up, but thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you, Clinton and Koye, for a great presentation. We've got lots of positive comments in the chat. There will be a recording of this, session made available so you can catch it later. And I am just going to address one last question because somebody asked if we could comment about the availability of these resources. Are some things free? Does anything require a subscription? So I will say a lot of what we showed through the hub, through the Living Atlas, there are many resources that are available for free. Most large colleges and universities in the US have access to Esri software through the university, and so tools such as ArcGIS Online, Community Analysts may already be available to you. And then there are, low-cost licenses available to individual students, nonprofit organizations, and others. So if you need any further information, you can contact, through Esri's website, there's a contact form, and we can help you sort out in more detail what you might have access to at no cost and what might require a subscription. So with that, again, happy GIS Day to everyone. Thank you to our presenters, and enjoy the rest of your day.